Hi, everyone. Thank you for watching. So today's book, I was like, our country's falling apart. What better author than to read than Margaret Atwood? But I didn't want to go in the future. I wanted to go back in time to a simpler place, actually in Canada. I had never heard of this story before, and it's based on a real life true crime. And you know I love true crime. This is called Alias Grace, and I didn't know until I read this book and was doing some research about the case that there's a Netflix series. I'm going to be binging that when I have time. Okay, don't know when that's going to be, but it's on my to watch list. So, this is a story about Grace Marks, an Irish immigrant in Canada who, along with, this is like the only picture they have of her, Grace, and then the accomplice, we'll get to that in a second, James McDermott. So, we have poor Grace, and she's literally poor. Her mother dies on the way over from Ireland. Her father was incapable of watching the large family. So poor Grace, at the young age of 12 or 13, because the age is a little off, couldn't, she's so young, and yet she was running this house while her dad was doing God knows what. So thankfully, they had a very kind landlady who took pity on Grace and understood the situation. So kind of stepped in as a mother role, helped out, but the dad fell behind on his rent. And what was popular at the time for poor families, this was before labor laws and educational laws, you went to work to help out. So he hired her out to a very wealthy family, and she learned how to become a maid at that family. And her father he was so abusive that he would show up to this nice family's home and demand her wages, which she refused to give all of her money to him because she was smart. She knew he would drink it. And eventually he stopped showing up because the stable boys were like, you can't be showing up here. So if you're going to show up and start trouble, we're going to end it for you. So he stopped showing up. And then last she heard, her siblings and he moved west. And that was the last she heard of them. She never heard from them again. So she becomes very good friends with Mary Whitney, another servant. They share a room, they share a bed, which they're servants. That's what you do. And she becomes very close to Mary. But Mary becomes a little close to one of the sons of this rich family. And one thing leads to another, and she ends up with a child. And it is clear that the father is not going to take responsibility. So Mary goes to take care of the situation. And because it was before, R.V. Wade or whatever the Canadian equivalent was at the time, she ends up dying from the procedure. And not only that, but she has just enough money to be buried. There is a gravestone that's really there, and it has just her name. Doesn't even have her dates because poor Grace couldn't afford to put the dates of her life on there. So that traumatizes Grace a lot, and she gets an opportunity to work at the Kinnear house outside of Toronto. And she's there for a little bit, and she should have gone with her gut. She gets there, something's not right with the head maid, Nancy. Nancy comes off as very kind, but then she shows signs of bipolar disorder. And it's clear that she's very close to Mr. Kinnear, Thomas Kinnear. Then there's this surly stable hand, James McDermott, who is just not a nice character from the beginning when we meet him. And he he comes into play later. But she just gets this feeling like she was duped into coming to work for this house. And she was. It turns out that Nancy is having a relationship with her unmarried uh, boss, Thomas Kinnear. And, Grace has been through this before. It didn't end well. And then it turns up that Nancy is with child and doesn't know what to do because it's going to cause a scandal. So poor Grace, she's trying to get out of there. And then how we find out the story is we have this emerging field of psychology, and we have Dr. Simon Jordan, who goes to visit Nancy at the penitentiary because she and James killed her their boss, Thomas Kinnear, and the housekeeper, Nancy Montgomery. When they escape, Grace takes the alias of Mary Whitney. Okay, so when they're found over in New York, because they just crossed the Great Lake, they are found, and she kind of gives them a false name, but the neighbors say, no, that's Grace, yada, yada, yada. They go to trial. They are tried separately, and they don't know if it's because of the age or the gender, but James and Grace are both found guilty because they don't deny it. But James is older, he is male, and he is executed for his crime. Grace, because she's young, she's a woman, and key point, she doesn't remember everything. She keeps saying, and then I slept, and then I slept. So her life is spared, but she's in and out of, and she switches from the insane asylum to the penitentiary. The governor's wife is very intrigued, because we've all been intrigued by murder podcasts. They just didn't have them back then. Invites Grace because everybody who meets her cannot believe that this young woman, she was convicted at the age of 16, tiny, malnourished, that she ever did this crime. So they bring in this doctor who is studying psychology, and he talks to her. And this is where I give it a 4 out of 5 because it was difficult to get into Grace's speaking style and the details of the day, like what she used to wash the clothes and blah, blah, blah. And you're wondering, like, why do I need to know everything? Well, it's because we get this first person narration from Grace's point of view, and then we get a third person narration observing Dr. Simon Jordan. He has his own demons that he's battling in Toronto. So you just see, and as we get towards the end, when he has to make the decision because they're all waiting on his report. Is she insane? Is she this multi-personality person? Because interestingly enough, a person from her past, Jedediah the peddler, shows up, and he's always had some mysticism to him, but he shows up as a hypnotist. And Simon just can't get Grace to remember that night. She keeps saying, this is what happened, and I slept. So they bring this guy in. They cover Grace's face. He puts her under a spell. And this different voice comes out of Grace and says, well, I'm Mary Whitney. So now everybody's crazy because, it's dark. It's like seance-like. And they're there to watch her being hypnotized. And this other personality comes out. So it's just so overwhelming to everybody that Dr. Jordan, has to leave, take a break. And even even Grace doesn't know what happened because she was hypnotized. So, spoiler alert, you end up like everybody in history who studied this case. Did she do it? Was she schizophrenic? Did she have an alter ego? Because she had, you read this book, and this poor girl could not catch a break. So, with childhood trauma, piled upon childhood trauma, adolescent trauma, that you do wonder if it was another personality that she named Mary Whitney. Um, Atwood also talks about a little bit about the case, and she talks about there are some people who think it was Mary Whitney and who took on Grace Mark's personality. So when you read the background of this, Atwood does a great job of kind of leading you where she thinks it goes. But I won't ruin everything about the ending, but she really, it's just fascinating because of the time, and you're dealing with mental health. So, she could have been faking, she could not have been faking. One of the witnesses comes back later and says, I was so angry that she kind of jilted me and my advances that I hated her. So I, testified against her when I realize now I shouldn't. So it is just fascinating. If you like murder mysteries, especially when we're dealing with, because now we know the term for it, PTSD. Back then they didn't know that. So it's just interesting to see the narration. Grace is like, I wish I could remember. Do I remember? Am I repressing it? And then you have the third person telling us about Dr. Jordan just going through his own stuff. And maybe he shouldn't have been, the one to do this. Okay, so that was a long one, but it is so good. It is so detailed. And at the end, you still have so many questions. So I can't wait to watch the Netflix series. Again, this is Margaret Atwood's Alias Grace. Four out of 5 stars, just because the style takes a while to get into. So thank you. Like, share, or subscribe.